Asus thinks that this is the ultimate mobile workstation for creators. A slim and sleek machine with some pretty insane specs, and a feature list as long as my arm, all tailored for creators. This is the Asus ProArt StudioBook Pro 16 OLED. Yes, they really put Pro in there twice, but it's actually somewhat deserved. Let me explain. Most devices that bear the Pro label normally indicate either that it's a slightly higher end version of a standard model that might cater more to enthusiast users, or it's their way of saying, well, we stripped out all of the actually useful features in the standard model and are now giving them or charging more to give them back to you. But with this, no, it's actually pretty serious. Take the display. This is a 3840 by 2400 panel, which, while not exactly conforming to many common media standards, gives you more vertical space to work with while editing. It gets impressively bright at a peak of 550 nits. It's not perfect for direct outdoor or even just direct lighting, but if you've got even a modicum of shade, or more realistically you're working indoors, you should be just fine. It covers 100% of the DCI-P3 spectrum, meaning it's just as vibrant as you could ever hope for, and yes, comes factory calibrated with a delta E of just 1.73, well shy of the 2.0 limit for the human eye. Being an OLED, it's also practically instant in its response time. While that is a measure that's normally applied to gaming machines, it's still relevant for creators, as assessing your work in motion, for example, animations or After Effects projects, is really important, and having the screen smear and blur your work as it moves isn't exactly what you want. There are two main downsides to this otherwise absolutely stunning display, and neither actually have to do with the panel itself. The first is the glossy finish. It catches the light very, very easily, and especially in any level of bright environments, can actually make it really difficult to see, or even impossible to just see what you're working on, as, well, you physically can't see anything on screen. I'm sure for the vast majority of use cases, this wouldn't be the end of the world, but it would have been nice to see a matte coating here instead to help diffuse and deflect that ambient light. The second is the touchscreen, or I suppose lack thereof. Even if this isn't designed to be an art machine, despite its name, it would still have been nice to have even basic touchscreen support built in. I'm sure that point will divide people, so feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. It all counts as, or all boosts engagement, but for me, I know that I'd find it useful to every now and again be able to tap on the screen, and if they could include proper stylus support, well, that's even better. Specs-wise, much in the same way that the display isn't just some standard gaming panel passed off as for creators, the specs aren't either. This is rocking a Xeon processor, specifically Xeon W11955M, which is basically an i9-11900H with a few workstation features like ECC memory support and total memory encryption. It's actually slightly higher clocked, with a 2.6 GHz base instead of 2.5 and up to 5 GHz boost instead of 4.9. Although this machine specifically does actually run slightly slower than the 11900H that I tested in the Zephyrus M16. It also rocks 64 GB of DDR4 3200 RAM modules, which, yes, are ECC or error correcting memory modules. This really isn't just a gaming machine that's tarted up. On top of that, you get 4 TB of NVMe SSD space in RAID 0 no less. One of the M.2 slots does support PCIe Gen 4 as it's directly connected to the CPU, although Asus have gone with 2 Micron Gen 3 2 TB NVMe SSDs here, which are perfectly fine. Personally, I'm somewhat against using RAID 0 here, as while Asus are clearly confident in the reliability, it seems like a step backwards to me. If you care about getting up to 7 GB per second in reads and writes, then use a large Gen 4 drive. Otherwise, in this setup, if this machine itself fails or gets damaged to the point where it won't boot, all of your data is gone. At least with a single drive, you can just remove it and plug it into another machine and read the data, but with RAID 0, only this specific motherboard knows how it's split up all of your data, and so if you do buy one of these, just make sure you have a good backup solution. Next is the GPU. This is also workstation specific, which is an RTX A5000 laptop. It's basically an RTX 3080 laptop chip, has the same number of cores, and can run at similar TDPs. This one specifically is rated for between 80 and 110 watts, although I clocked it running up to 155 watts at its peak. The biggest difference though is in the VRAM. This has 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 for you to play with. Yeah, I think that's a pretty decent amount, don't you? On the topic of power, the CPU can kick back a cool 92 watts in its rendering mode. In theory, it should be able to spike all the way up to 109 watts, which is its PL2 limit, but thanks to the aggressively quiet fan curves, it never got that high. In fact, even in its rendering mode, the machine was really pretty insistent on remaining as quiet as possible, which is actually a rather nice change from the standard gaming machines that mostly just turn into jet engines at the mere sight of a game or a render. In its normal mode, it did its very best to not spin up the fans pretty much at all, so for working on a quiet train or set, this does a great job. It is worth covering the performance of that Xeon as well. So starting with Cinebench R20 single-threaded, in its rendering mode, it's actually the fastest chip I've had and the first chip to break 600 points. That's likely thanks to its up to 5 GHz single core boost speed compared to the 4.9 on the 11900H, which is actually only a couple of points behind this in terms of score. In multi-threaded, thanks to the i9's much more aggressive boost and willingness to abuse its fans, it holds a pretty decent lead over the Xeon of around 500 points comparing turbo and rendering mode performance. The 11955M actually falls behind AMD's more mid-range 8-core, the 5800H, which interestingly draws between 10 and 20 watts less power while doing so. Moving on to Blender, rendering the BMW scene, again the 11900H is technically faster here, although you can quite clearly see the difference between the normal and rendering modes, where the standard mode takes 52 seconds longer to render the same scene. That's 25% slower. In the Gooseberry render, that difference is only made worse thanks to this being a much more complex and therefore lengthy render. Switching to the rendering mode saves you just over 4 minutes to render that one frame. Like, 4 minutes is an insane amount of time to be saving. Can you imagine forgetting to switch over to the rendering mode and wasting 20% more time than you needed to? That would definitely be painful. With that said, in its high performance mode, it does offer reasonable performance, although it is still slower than the 11900H and a number of the 5th gen Ryzen chips. In Puget Bench for Premiere Pro, again, it performs well, but it only really ties with the Ryzen options and gets pretty thoroughly trounced by the 11900H by over 100 points. In Puget Bench's After Effects test, it actually runs as one of the slowest options. Still fantastic performance for sure, but again the 11900H is practically light years ahead. And finally, in Photoshop, it's a similar story, although this time only literally a couple of points behind the i9 and otherwise ahead of everything else. It's important to note with those Puget Bench tests that those are not necessarily exclusively testing things like rendering performance. That test is something designed to evaluate the performance across the board of the whole usage experience of those programs. And so it might just be the case that certain tasks like certain effects, for example, might perform a bit better with higher clock speeds or higher sustained clock speeds like the 11900H can offer, whereas in straight rendering performance or even in total capability with the massive amount of VRAM and system RAM, that's potentially much more of this is a more usable machine overall. It's not all about the raw performance though, especially when you get some rather nice creator-specific features like this dial. This is much like the Surface dial. It's meant to be a one-size-fits-all place where, depending on the application you have open, you have a number of different controls all at your fingertips. In Premiere, you can have it zoom in and out of the timeline or skip back and forward. In After Effects, you can scroll in and out of the timeline, and in Photoshop, you can zoom in and out. So here's the thing, I absolutely love this idea. Having controls on a physical dial that you can spin around with tactile notches as it turns is absolutely amazing, and I love the idea. The trouble is the implementation, at least in this case, I would say needs a bit of work. The physical dial, while screwed in on all four corners internally, isn't all that well supported and has got a little too much play side to side and forward and backwards. And the button itself that lets you switch between the different tools and select them is mushy throughout its travel. It also feels like the steps in the rotation are just a little too far apart, and all of that kind of adds together to have a less premium feel than I would like. On the software side, it only works with Premiere, Photoshop, After Effects, and Lightroom. And even then, it's actually got a pretty small list of options that you can choose from. And none are really suited for a dial like this. Zooming in and out in the timeline is something that I personally map to Z and Shift Z, and is arguably easier to use that way than to take my hand off of the keyboard and spin this dial. Surprisingly, even in Photoshop, the options that you have there don't include things like brightness, curves, or HSL controls. Only in Lightroom do you have those options. It's the same issue with the dedicated action button to the right side of the spacebar and technically the reprogrammable Windows key. Again, I love the idea, but all of the options you have are things that you can use standard hotkeys for, and you often wouldn't need to move your hands to go and press them. I would love to see more options to choose from here and more programs supported. Interestingly, despite not having any touchscreen support, they did decide to add 1024 level pressure sensitivity to the touchpad. So I guess if you do want to draw with this on the fairly small for a drawing surface touchpad, you can. What's more unique though is the triple mouse buttons. This is actually a pretty big deal, as the number of programs, especially 3D ones, that require the middle mouse button is astonishingly high. This is a great addition, although it is somewhat downplayed by the weirdly mushy buttons. They have such long travel, but again are definitely on the more mushy side, which again leads to a less premium feel than perhaps I would like. As for the I/O, again they've really paid attention to detail here, with the key point for me being the SD Express 7.0 reader, which can read at just shy of 1 gigabyte per second. That's a massive step up from the often USB 2 SD card readers that are included in many other machines, and is something that I can see prospective owners of this sort of machine really making good use of. For everything else, they've included both USB-A and C ports running USB 3.2 Gen 2x2, aka 20 gigabit per second, and Thunderbolt 4 with up to 40 gigabit per second. For displays, that's HDMI 2.1, which is great to see available, and you even get up to 2.4 gigabit per second Wi-Fi from this adorably small Intel controller, or this module that's built actually onto the board. The built-in speakers are Harman Kardon branded, and while they're definitely not absolutely perfect and actually still bottom firing, they are remarkably clear and, even when loud, and offer an impressive, especially when on a hard surface, slightly harsh range. I can't say that I would plan on editing all of the videos from them directly, but in a pinch, I wouldn't be mad about having to make use of them. And the same could be said for the microphones. You have a quad mic array up at the top of the display, which actually spans pretty much the full width of it, and they sound okay. It's not perfect, but for a quick video call, or if you have absolutely nothing else you can use, then it's nice that you have at least a reasonable quality available to you. As for the webcam, well, that's going to be okay for video calls. I'm in some pretty bright studio lighting, so it actually looks a bit better than it perhaps would otherwise. It's 720p. It's fairly standard for a laptop, but what is nice is you do have a physical privacy shield that you can slide over to physically block the camera, which is a nice addition, especially on a work machine. They even went all out and got this ISV certified with Adobe and Autodesk, and even give you 3 months free of Creative Cloud subscription, which definitely isn't too bad. Oh, and before anyone asks, yes, this can game remarkably well. I'll throw up the chart so that you can have a quick look at its performance, but it's basically an RTX 3080 laptop and 11900H, so beyond some driver performance, it's perfectly capable should you want to game on it in your spare time. So, is this absolute beast of a machine worth buying? Sadly, I'm not 100% sure on the pricing, but I think it's pretty reasonable to expect that, especially for this model, it certainly won't be cheap. For your money, you do get a lot, though, and it's very clear that this is a proper mobile workstation rather than just a high-power consumer laptop. And the fact that it's sporting ECC RAM, a Xeon W chip, and what used to be called a Quadro shows that that is the case. At the moment, for me, the dial is just a bit of a gimmick. I really would love to see it improved, and I think with some software updates, I can see it being incredibly useful. The display is stunning. Like, seriously, this is easily one of the best panels I've seen, full stop, and editing on it is absolutely amazing. I am used to editing on multiple monitors at my desktop, so to go down to a single one is a bit of a downside, but I think it would be pretty hard to beat this level of performance and portability on top of such a gorgeous display. As a business expense, I can see this making its way into the hands of a fair number of creators. I expect that it's going to be pretty obtainable otherwise, but they do sell lower spec versions and even Ryzen models if you would prefer, say, the lower power consumption, albeit while also dropping the Thunderbolt support. It could definitely do with some refinements, but as a package for creators in general, I think they've done a pretty remarkable job. Now with that said, those are my thoughts, but I would love to hear yours in the comments down below. What do you think of the ProArt StudioBook Pro 16 OLED? Is this a machine you would pick up yourself, or would you go with one of the lower end models? Are you just not a creator in general, would prefer a gaming laptop instead? Feel free to let me know in those comments down below. I'll do my best to find a link to this, ideally on Amazon, as that will be an affiliate link that you can check out in the description down below. So if I can find it, I'll leave that there. Otherwise, I'll leave a link to Asus's website where you can check out a bit more information about it directly. But that's kind of that. Like I said, if you have any of your own thoughts or any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments down below. If you want to see more videos like this one on a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday basis, then do hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell notification icon. If you want to check out or ways to support the channel as well as just subscribing, you can do that directly by using the YouTube join button to get access to our Money in Discord chat, sponsor free videos, and a whole load of other stuff, or you can support directly on Patreon instead if you prefer. You can also pick up hoodies or t-shirts like this one, or a load of other cool designs, or you can just use the affiliate links so you don't have to support directly, but you're definitely helping out. If you're buying from places like Overclock UK, there's a link in the description for that, or there's a load of other options for things like VPNs, Humble Bundle, Streamlabs, OBS, and a whole lot of other stuff, so do feel free to check those out in the description as well. I'll leave some more videos on the end cards, maybe the Acer Concept D line, as that's a very similar line, if a sort of one rung less of a creator specific machine, so feel free to check that out. And otherwise, thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it, I'll see you on the next video.